as I started to notice the room shrinking in front of me, I started to realize I'm dying and I'm being pulled into this tunnel. And even though I'd never experienced this before, I think there's some human knowing or some old memory that we all have that's kind of how you leave.
Hello everyone, welcome to Beyond the Veil. Today, Nuestro Nanamoli recalls a transformative experience that began with a painful accident. After a serious injury, he entered a state of consciousness where he felt both physical agony and spiritual transcendence. Following the accident, he began sewing, which led him to create a tapestry symbolizing the interconnectedness of all life.
I was at a lake party. I was a zipline tour guide at the time, and I had just broken up with my fiance. So I was feeling a lot of heartbreak, and I was with a lot of people at the lake, but because my heart was really hurting, or I was really feeling a lot of pain and missing her, it had only been 3 months since we broke up, I decided to swim out to the middle of the lake and just float on my back, put my ears below the surface of the water, and just be. And there was a moment when I was in the water where I entered into a really peaceful space. The tension I had from that relationship was just released. And in that moment, I saw or understood how nice it is just to be present, and how no matter what is going on in the world or in my life, I can just be with the water, be with the trees, just be with myself. If I'm centered on just where I am, the thoughts of the past go away, the worries of the future go away. I had the small desire or small prayer or small wish, may I spread this with other people. And I now see that that desire was like a tiny seed, and it's grown a massive tapestry. So I swim to this dock. There's this rickety old plastic blue water slide. People are going down, and I think, okay, I should join the festivities. I climb up the aluminum stairs. I get to the top of the slide, and I go down head first. And it was blissful. It was really enjoyable. And I came off the end going very fast. I kind of flew over the water, and then I dove into the water and swept my arms back to go deep. And it was a hot summer day, so the water felt really enjoyable. And then I struck the bottom. And what I didn't know was the water was 2 feet deep. And my neck and spine, my head was pushed into my spine and pushed to the side. And in that moment, I didn't know I had broken my neck. I did break my neck, but I thought I had been struck by lightning. It was such an intense pain. It radiated out throughout my whole body. And a couple different things happened in that moment. I felt my head buried in the rocks and the sand of the lake bed, and I had this glimmer of feeling like I was a seed, like I was just planted. My whole body was shaking in pain under the water. I couldn't breathe, and I heard a voice within me that said, "Slow down." Then I knew something was really wrong, and I stood up out of the water. And when I stood up, I saw that the water only came up to my knees, and around me in the air, there were these orbs of light. And normally we hit our head and we see stars. These stars expanded to maybe the size of basketballs. And it seemed as though they each had a personality, and they had each turned toward me, kind of to see if I needed help. Or, kind of reflecting on it now, I think maybe they knew I was close to death, so they were getting ready for that transition. So I stumble out of the water, I make it to the beach. I'm kind of asking for help, but I couldn't really speak much. Something had happened to my vocal cords. I couldn't feel my fingertips. The whole world felt sideways. Friends helped me over to a bench and laid me down. And because of my military training, I knew I was going into shock. So I asked them to elevate my feet so that I could have more blood in my head. But then the voice within me said, "You have to go now." And it was very commanding. And I knew in that moment I didn't have much time before I died, or whatever was happening in my body was so intense, I needed to go to a hospital. So I told people I needed to go to a hospital, but I couldn't really speak. Nobody was really listening. So I just took myself and pushed myself up off the bench. Well, that was my intention. But because I couldn't feel my hands and I was somewhat paralyzed or somewhat screwed up from my neck being broken and the nerves, whatever was happening in my neck, I just ended up falling off the bench into the gravel face first and bending my neck more. And at that point, people started seeing, okay, something's really wrong. So I could feel hands lifting me, moving to a car, and we drove to the hospital. It was a 40-minute drive. Once we arrived, the nurses and doctors saw the severity of whatever was going on. I still didn't quite understand what was happening in my body, but I was feeling incredible pain. One thing I was aware of, when I was wheeled into the hospital in a wheelchair, before they put me into a neck brace, I was wheeled into a cavernous room, a waiting room in Asheville, North Carolina, and I was wheeled right in front of this old black man who was facing me, and he was also in incredible pain, and he was holding his stomach and screaming, and his screams were echoing through the whole space. And in that moment, I was so aware that we were drawn together because of our vibration of intense pain. There was some camaraderie, and even though I couldn't scream my pain, I really felt like we were brothers, and I was again aware of how like attracts like, and I knew in that moment, wow, we're the people suffering the most pain in this moment, and look how we're like magnets coming together. They took me into scans and began checking to see what was wrong. And the next person who spoke to me was a surgeon, and he came over, he said, "We looked at your spine and you totally broke your neck. And because you were driving and moving, all of the pieces of your bones have migrated around, and somehow they haven't sliced through your spinal cord, but you're centimeters away from being paralyzed, and we have to have surgery done immediately. But because it's such a complicated surgery, we have to go through the front of your neck and the back of your neck and put on all these screws and take out all this bone. We have to assemble a team, so that will be done tomorrow." And they offered me morphine, but I knew from all of my meditation training that the moment of death is very important, and it's important to be very aware. So I declined the morphine, and I just laid there observing the pain. And I tried my best just to be aware of it, not as pain, but just as change, because it was a massive amount of change, electrical change, chemical change, the pain radiating up and down my body. And I tried to be just aware of it, and I explain it kind of like riding a wave as a surfer. There was a point where I was able to just ride the pain and just be in awe of how intense it was, kind of like I had taken really spicy food into my mouth, and just be aware of the flavor of the pain as opposed to hating it and wanting it to go away. Everything below your body is on fire. Normally you're paralyzed, but somehow I could still feel, and it was very intense. I did that for a couple hours until I couldn't take it anymore. I was sweating and the bed was soaked, and I said, okay, I'll take morphine. So the nurses come in, they give me morphine, and then they started dimming the lights very slowly, and I started being pulled into a tunnel. The first thought was, wow, they're being really kind, but they can just turn the lights off. They don't have to do it that slow. But then as I started to notice the room shrinking in front of me, I started to realize I'm dying and I'm being pulled into this tunnel. And even though I'd never experienced this before, I think there's some human knowing or some old memory that we all have that's kind of how you leave. You leave through a tunnel or something like that. And then I could see the nurses running back into the room, and I could hear still with my ears my own heart flatline. And when they ran in, something in the energy of them running in or of me seeing them brought me back to my body. So I kind of slipped back down the tunnel into my body. They started checking on me. I could hear my heart beating again. That was the first moment of starting to disconnect. The next day, I was being prepared for surgery, and I had a strong feeling to ask where my physical body was going. The words came out of my mouth very soft because it was difficult to speak, but I could feel that the questioning wasn't coming from me. It was coming from somebody else or somewhere else, and that was important to know where I would be. So they said, you're going to go, up to this floor, you're going to go over to that room, then we're going to come back here, take this elevator. And once I knew exactly where I was going, I felt very much at peace, and I immediately began to observe my breathing. And I did this because I knew I might die. They told me, you may not wake up from surgery. I was at peace, and I just began observing the breath coming into my nostrils, going out. And I did this so that I wouldn't have any thought of the future moment and any thought of what I was leaving behind if I were to die. And the more I was just aware of the feeling of the breath, the more the future and the past were released until I was very centered. And I think this helped in the experience of what was to come. The next memory I have is not going somewhere, but it was at the end of some long conversation. I was standing in front of a doorway, like an arched doorway. It was maybe 15 feet tall, but you have to understand that I was out of my body. So space and time and size doesn't really matter, but to me, it was just bigger. It was very tall. And within the doorway were 6 luminous beings of light. And on the edges of them were a white light that kind of radiated out into blue. And the blue faded all the way into the deepest darkness. And then there were kind of stars scattered about, and we were just floating in space. In the center of them, and it looked like they were wearing robes or they were kind of hooded, but it was incredibly peaceful. And in the center of their faces, it was dark. Now, I've shared this only twice before in interviews, and some people will say, oh, had dark faces, they were demons. They were the most peaceful beings I've ever been in front of. They were coming from before light and before dark. Wherever this source of communication was coming from, it's before the separation. So we're living in a world now where we're very aware of good and bad. We're very aware of light and dark. It's very easy to see that difference. But it all comes from the same place, and it all comes back to the same place. There's something that exists that is even before light. It's where the light comes from. And the faces of these people was so pure and so unified, and I could feel we're all a part of it and we're all interwoven and connected. That's what was at the center of them, and that's what I was speaking to. So if you're imagining like an inky black darkness, it wasn't that. It's always been there. It's like the silence between a song, and we were having the end of a conversation, and we were making an agreement. And there were 2 parts to this agreement. One was, you won't remember anything you've seen, because if you do, you'll never shut up about it. And then that was the words they used. And it was funny to me because that's kind of how I would speak, but I listened to their guidance, and I haven't talked about this that much. And then the second part was, you have to do the work. And I had no idea what the work was. We had our goodbye, and I was then turned away from them and started to move down, I could say a tunnel, but it was as though space was wide open, and I was just kind of moving forward and down. And I could start to see the hospital rune, but it just existed in space. And as I became more aware of what I was looking at, I could see my body on the stretcher, and I could feel that I was running. I felt like I had no bones in my body. I felt like I had no weight to my body. It was so much fun. I felt like I was trying to learn to run, but I didn't have to do anything. And I felt like my limbs were flopping around, but I didn't have any limbs. It was just like light spraying off me, or like rainbows coming out of me. It was such a nice feeling. And as I moved toward my body, I could see the nurses in the room, and suddenly I merged with my body. But my vision from my external vision from the body and my human vision, it merged. And I could see the same thing I was seeing even before I entered my body. I started moving my limbs. I was so happy. The nurses kind of told me to settle down. And then the pain returned. But I was so fresh to the feeling of being human. It wasn't pain yet. It was just almost fun and enjoyable. I stayed in the hospital for three days. I couldn't move. I was in a neck brace. I had things coming out of my neck to drain blood. They had put in 6 screws, 2 in the front, 2 in the back, titanium scaffolding. I returned home from the hospital, and about a month after being home, I suddenly had the strange desire to pick up a needle and a thread. I wanted to sew a rose, a very tiny rose, maybe like this big. I didn't really know why, but as soon as I started threading the needle through the cloth, I felt an incredible amount of joy and peace, similar to what I felt when I was standing in front of these beings. And I didn't know how I was doing it, but I knew what to do next with the sewing. I didn't know what it was supposed to become, but the same voice that had kind of been coming through me gave me the instruction, you need to choose a mantra. You need to choose a mental thought to hold as you're doing this action. I played around with some different ideas, but what I landed on was, may this stitch bring peace to many people. And at that time, friends were just coming over to visit me, and I was just hoping that I could share something with them to convey the peace that I'd felt when I left my body and the peace that had kind of been gifted to me when I returned to my body. But it wasn't really anything given. It was just a reminder that we all have this peace within us, and that it's our greatest strength, and that an army of 10,000 men is not as strong as a peaceful abiding. a library full of books is not as helpful as just one line of verse that brings peace. Now it's been 4 years. Now it's been 12,000 hours of sowing. I've sown in the Netherlands, Jamaica, South Africa, Costa Rica, Spain, Italy. And what I've realized is would take 12,000 hours to explain. Every time I'm sowing, I'm receiving some kind of wisdom, but it's not mine. It's just the general wisdom that exists in the ether, or that we're all connected to. But there are some points that I could kind of share, and I hope the right ones come to mind so that I can share them with you and it can bring you some sense of peace. The first one is we're all very interwoven. And each person, you watching this video, you're very important to the tapestry of everything. And there's no person on the planet who is in the wrong place, and nobody is doing the wrong thing. We're all learning. Now, there are some people that choose very difficult paths. They're committing unhelpful, unwholesome actions. These are like bitter seeds that they're planting, and they will produce bitter fruit, and from that they will learn. I'm not an artist. It's not like I was doing paint and then I started sewing. I just started sewing, and I have no idea really what I'm doing. I just trust now that something's helping me. But the centerpiece is a tree. I've realized I could have sewn a face or a person, a peaceful person. But whenever we see artwork of an individual, we judge it because we've experienced people, and we know people can lie, people can be mean, people can hurt you. Nobody judges a tree. Trees are very kind, and they grow wherever they're planted, and they just adjust to the surroundings. And if you cut them down, so be it. They're not going to scream. But the longer we allow a tree to grow, the more it gives to us. The more it gives us shade. The older it becomes, the more beautiful it becomes. And it always fashions and models itself to be the most beautiful tree in that area. And so I try to be, as much as I can, like a tree. I sit down, I have a needle and thread, and I just sew in meditation. I take long pauses just to observe my breathing and just to feel what I'm feeling in my body. And I realize that there's incredible strength in that. If I'm not speaking, I'm not harming anybody verbally. If I'm just sitting, I'm not harming anybody physically. And if I'm not focused on anything other than my breath, then I'm not harming anybody even in thought. I'm not having any resentful thoughts, any thoughts of anger or any thoughts of worry. Tensions that we hold in our body get held somewhere in the physical form. Our minds are so super drived right now with our cell phones, and we're so visually attuned, we forget to feel our body. So as I sew, if I feel any tension in my body, I focus on that, I send it love and peace, and I just keep sewing. And this is kind of what's come out. As I was sewing, something came through from these beings, and I was so grateful because there's a story, it's a parable that's in the Bible, and I never understood it, and nobody could explain it. The parable is about the camel going through the eye of the needle. So the verse is, and I'm paraphrasing, that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven. Now that makes no sense, because that's the eye of the needle, and a camel can't fit through there. So that's confusing. And when I hear that line, it just confuses me and brings no peace. The story has been lost. During the time of Jesus, going from Europe or Rome all the way to Asia, there was the Silk Road, or a road or a trail that people would take to trade silk and spices. And there were shortcuts, and there were maps. If you looked at a map, there was a long way around and there was a shortcut. Rich men would look at this map, they had never traveled it before, and they would take the shortcut, and they wouldn't listen to advice of people who had taken the trail or gone on the path before. And if you take the shortcut, it's a very narrow space. It goes through slot canyons and narrow valleys, and at a certain point on the shortcut, it reaches what was called the eye of the needle. It was a very narrow space. It was so narrow that it had to be carved out a little bit, enough so that a camel could pass through. So if you were a traveler, traveling light, you would get to this shortcut trail, you would take it all the way to the eye of the needle, you would take all of your luggage or all of your belongings off your camel, you'd carry it through, and then you'd bring your camel through, and you could pass through the eye of the needle. but you could only pass through, or the camel could only pass through if it was totally free of all attachment. A rich person would get to the eye of the needle with their caravans and their wagons, and if they wanted to get through, they would have to disassemble everything and move all of their stuff through the eye of the needle, and it was nearly impossible. And it would take so much time, and they would learn the lesson, or hopefully, that with all of your attachments, you can't pass through this narrow space. So the parable, as Jesus tells it, is that if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you need to release all attachments. And we also, to understand it more, we don't live in kingdoms now. At the time of Jesus, there were kingdoms everywhere. Now we live in states. So we could say the state of heaven. And what is heaven? Heaven is what everybody who has an NDE sees. It's a state of peace, the state of love, the state of bliss. So to enter the state of peace, you have to be like a camel going through the eye of the needle. You have to release everything. You have to release who you are, all of your attachments, all of your knowledge, and you just have to be where you are. And if you can do that, you enter the kingdom of heaven. And where is it? It's within. It's everywhere. The guidance I would offer, and you can try it later, I'm just planting a seed for you, is to sit in silence. You don't have to call it meditation. You don't have to call it prayer. We all have ideas of what prayer and meditation are, and we have some slight resistance to it. Otherwise, we'd be doing it more. But you literally just have to sit in silence with the legs folded and close your eyes. People who have NDEs all receive grand messages, beautiful visions, and it's beautiful to hear because it reminds us of something that we kind of know, and we kind of want that for ourselves. But if you want to receive a message, you have to do what everybody who has had an NDE has done. And what we've all done is close our eyes. Some of us for a while. People are in comas, but everybody checks out of their senses. I hope and pray and have the desire that at some point you take some time, either when you wake up or before you go to bed, just to close your eyes and just to sit quietly and do nothing. If it hurts or it's painful or you're bored, just be with that. And give yourself a moment to receive some wisdom. Give yourself a moment to receive some visions. If you want a sign from God, maybe be quiet and let him say something.